We ask around Lansing, seeing what people think of solitary confinement.
What do you know about solitary confinement?
It's when they put a prisoner in like a solid room by themselves, pretty much, I think.
What do you think about it?
Depending on the punishment, probably reasonable for some and not for others.
Do you think it's helping or hurting our prisoners?
Probably hurting more than anything, I would say.
If you could, would you change our policies on solitary confinement?
Probably, yeah.
And what would you do to change them?
Not sure. Maybe be very specific on what they're for, I guess. I don't know the specifics on how they work as of right now, but making sure they're appropriate for the punishment, I guess I would say.
Thank you. That's all.
Yeah, no problem.
Here you go.
Okay. So what do you know about solitary confinement?
Not much. Not really research it.
Do you understand what it is though?
Yeah, it's putting a prisoner in their own cell, correct?
What do you think about it?
It's good if you're trying to isolate violent prisoners, I guess.
Do you think it's helping or hurting the prisoners?
Well, probably hurting in general.
And if you could, would you change the policy?
More therapy. I mean, probably a better idea to try and make the system a little bit better than just put them in a room alone.
Thank you. That's all. Bye.
The general consensus seems to be solitary confinement is hurting our prisoners and it does nothing good for them. Most people want to change but don't know where to start or what to do. Listen now to a man who was in solitary confinement and his feelings afterwards.
After 4 decades in solitary confinement, Albert Woodfox, one of the so-called Angola 3, is to be released. But what happens when someone who spent so long behind bars without any human interaction is released?
I was already angry, and it made me a lot more angry. And eventually, the anger to me, as I look back and reflectively, the anger was in me to a point where, I believe that I could have possibly taken somebody's life just like that, just based on the intensity of the anger inside of me at that time. And so I avoided having conversations with people, particularly around subjects such as my incarceration.
Being released back into everyday life after years in solitary confinement poses huge challenges, and for some it's simply too much. Earlier this week, 22-year-old Khalif Browder, who'd been held without trial at the notorious Rikers Island prison in New York, committed suicide.
I probably would have fared a lot better had I actually had a plan and had a well-structured and committed support network. Somebody who had been through, at least some of what I've been through in this prison.
It's estimated there were around 80,000 prisoners who were in solitary confinement across the United States. For some, that means spending 23 hours a day in cramped conditions with maybe an hour for exercise. So of course, the challenges of entering everyday life are huge.
Many people often assume that solitary confinement is a quiet place. And in fact, the reality is solitary confinement is assaultingly loud. You're hearing on either side of you the sounds of deterioration of the people around you, to then be released onto the streets. There's this profound disorientation with the world around you.
Next is a short summary of a report on the brain after solitary confinement and some statistics of solitary confinement in U.S. prisons.
A neuroscientist from the University of Michigan has come out and said that research suggests solitary confinement may dramatically alter the physical structure of a human's brain after just a couple of days. They say the lack of physical interaction with the natural world, the lack of social interaction, and the lack of touch and visual stimulation can actually shrink the hippocampus in the brain. That's the part of the brain responsible for memory, spatial orientation, and control of emotions. So a man who had his conviction overturned and was in solitary confinement spoke about this, and he said that his eyesight and physical orientation are permanently impaired as a result of being in solitary confinement. Quote, "My geography is way off. I get lost sometimes in my own neighborhood. I believe that this is a result of my solitary confinement." Other symptoms include extreme paranoia, self-mutilation, hypersensitivity to sound, light, and touch, severe cognition dysfunction, rage, and hyper-violent tendencies. So this is all stuff that happens as a direct result of people being locked up in solitary confinement. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the legal status of that in the U.S. right now? Well, it's unconstitutional to do solitary confinement for the mentally ill, and you can't do it indefinite, and you can't do it unreviewed for other prisoners. But you could still do it, and they do a lot of it. In fact, I have some numbers here. At least 80,000 U.S. prisoners are held in solitary confinement by some estimates, and it is frequently used not to segregate dangerous prisoners, but as a means of social control or mental health treatment. In California, more than 500 inmates have reportedly been kept in confinement for 10 to 28 years.
Next, we have a more in-depth look of solitary confinement and more research studies to learn about.
In 1990, the UN called for the abolition of solitary confinement, and more recently in 2011, a UN expert said that the practice could amount to torture. Some estimates say the number of inmates held in what is called SHU, special housing units, might be as high as 80,000 across the U.S. While it used to be used as a short-term punishment to crack down on violence, prisons now routinely use the practice. While stays used to be only a few days, some prisoners have been in solitary for years. The typical SHU cell isn't much bigger than your closet, like 6 by 10 feet, with only a small bed, a sink, a toilet, and social contact is kept to a bare minimum. They receive their food through a slot in the door and very rarely have video conferences with family. There's nothing to do but stare at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling that never turn off. But what kind of life is that, and what does it do to the mind? Humans are very social creatures. One study published in the journal Perspectives on Psychological Science found that loneliness and social isolation can have just as much of a threat to health as obesity. Other studies, like one published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found that it has serious psychological effects as well, like inducing anxiety, aggression, and memory impairment. The researchers think it has to do with an enzyme in the brain. 5-alpha reductase type 1 is important for the production of the hormone allopregnanolone, which regulates levels of stress. In socially isolated mice, the researchers found that the production of that enzyme was reduced by 50%, which could mean more stressful hormones in the brain. Another study in the journal Nature Neuroscience found changes in the prefrontal cortex of socially isolated mice. The cells in the brain that make white matter made less of it after 8 weeks of isolation. This lessening of white matter production in the prefrontal cortex impacted emotional and cognitive behavior. The animals couldn't socialize as well when they met new mice. But total social isolation and sensory deprivation like solitary confinement is really difficult to study. You might know about the famous rhesus monkey experiments in the 50s, where baby monkeys were taken away from their mother and given fake wire moms. Well, the same researcher studied how isolation affects the monkeys, where baby monkeys were separated from their mothers and placed in what's known as a pit of despair. Basically, it's a metal container they couldn't climb out of. After months of this solitary existence, they exhibited mental distress and showed signs of full-blown depression. It doesn't sound like something you'd want to do to a human being, yet that's what it seems like is going on inside of America's prisons. One review of the literature found that prisoners experience a wide range of ill effects from the experience. One study found that a great majority of inmates in solitary suffered from serious psychological trauma. 91% of the prisoners sampled suffered from anxiety and nervousness. More than 80% suffered headaches, lethargy, and trouble sleeping, and 70% feared impending breakdown. There could even be physical damage as a result of psychological stress. Some inmates turn to self-harm and lash out in other physically harmful ways. The lack of sunlight and exercise can lead to other kinds of physical distress. All of this puts a lot of strain on a person. According to psychiatrist Terry Coopers, prisoners in isolation account for just 5% of the total prison population, but nearly half of its suicides. Some research shows that it doesn't make prison any less violent of a place. One recent study published in the journal Quantitative Criminology found that solitary confinement made prisoners no more or less likely to commit violent crimes when released back into the general population. So that kind of takes the meat out of the argument that it makes prisons safer. One study published in the journal Criminal Justice and Behavior found that removing mentally ill prisoners from solitary confinement and adequately treating their illness actually reduced prison violence.
Thank you very much for watching our presentation documentary. If you have more questions, just ask me or my project partners and we can answer them for you. And if you want to learn more about how to change this or how to get more involved in this, just let us know and we can help you out with that.